book written is because I still believe there's nothing like it ever. Because whenever you search for India, Africa, you will get China, Africa. And India comes out as an adjunct of that research. So much money is pumped all over the world into studying China, Africa. And then they say, oh well, what is India doing? And that happens. So my idea was that I had the experience, I had the knowledge, and I could write a book which only about India and Africa. So the Indian Council of World Affairs said, yes, we want this book, but they doubled my mandate. My book was actually only on economic relations. And they said, no, nobody has ever studied the development cooperation, which we have done. So we want an assessment of that. So I think there is a brutally frank assessment of our development cooperation in this book, since I was in many cases the initiator and a trifle saddened by what happened, but in many cases happy by successes as well. What is the title of the book? The title of the book is the Harambee factor. Harambee is, as our Swahili expert Ambassador Shetagri knows, is the spirit of cooperation, it's partnership, pulling together. So in Swahili, when you pull together, you say Harambee, you pull Harambee. And in some old African movies, you will see the Africans pulling together and they'll say Harambee. Some people believe that the etymology of Harambee comes from Har Ambe, which the early Indians in the 19th century used while pushing heavy loads, and Swahili, the people working around, picked that up and converted it into a shorter. But this etymology today in Africa, they don't want to accept. And I think this is important. The reason I brought it up is because in many ways, nobody in Africa today wants to accept a heritage kind of relationship. And if you are still talking of heritage in your speeches, then you lost it. To be with it, you have to be contemporary. Neither in India nor in Africa are leaders of that generation who fought for independence, decolonization, anti-apartheid, joined forces together, Mahatma Gandhi. Even the second phase of counter-terrorism, permanent seat on the Security Council is all passé. Today it is transactional. What can you do for me? And I will do something for you. And that is what my book ends up with, and I will come to that. But invariably, whenever you talk of India, people talk about China. So I think you better look at China out of the way first. So with the African Union, and with Africa, actually India was an older and preferred partner. And the short line which a French-speaking commissioner of the African Union once said, he said, China does more, India does better. And I think that is where we leave China out of this. Indian model of cooperation is quite unique, and therefore it is very difficult to define it. Nobody had defined it, because in Indian foreign policy we don't define things, we do them. So here what happened was that there is the trade is the first aspect. When Vasco da Gama came, he actually followed existing trading routes which were already happening for centuries, nothing new. So trade was a factor in Indo-African relations for centuries. Second, again looking back with modern parlance, it was private sector. It was no government initiative or private initiative. That is very important. The third aspect was that there was a large amount of skill development and capacity building. Again, modern terms, but take them back. In Ethiopia, if you go to Lalibela, where the 11th, 12th century rock-hewn churches, every church has an Indian swastika at the bottom. That is because the architects and the masons and the people who actually did all the work were all from India. Similarly, in the palaces of Gondar, 1658, around the time Taj Mahal was completed, were all Indian architects. There's so much of India in those things, and you can see it. So there was a huge exchange of culture, and which was then leading to building local skills, transfers of technology in the cultural sense. So private sector, trade, the exchanges of skill, and then broadly what today we call human resource development. After World War II, people like Emperor Haile Selassie said, India is the model I wish to follow. And that is something then which caught on in Africa as they became independent. And Haile Selassie brought in Indian teachers, largely from Goa and Kerala, who played such an important role that we cannot fathom the impact that they have made on India-Ethiopia and subsequently India-Africa relations. The colonial governments followed this in East Africa, which was large. It was consisting of Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania, and also in partly in Ghana, Nigeria. Over the years, this gave way to program often funded by UNESCO and others, and sometimes domestically funded, for college professors to come into African countries, where Indian professors played and continue to play a very big role. So the human resource development angle is very important. So if you take these few things that I have mentioned, those lead to the Indian approach to Africa. And what we tried to do in the India-Africa summits was actually develop this approach and give it institutionalized support. So in between, there is the period where we are politically very close. So every African country which emerges from colonialism gets an automatic identity by joining the OAU, which was set up in '63, and the non-aligned movement, of which India was one of the founders. So India was looked up as the non-aligned father, and we follow you. But in between, there were the peacekeeping operations, a very large number of peacekeeping operations in Africa, where Indian military units went and put up very good show to impress the Africans that military should be like this. So many of them started having military academies or training missions, and many of them sent officers to be trained. Be that as it may, some of the officers went back and staged coups and then said, I was very happy with India, but that was not what we taught them, but they did do it. The earliest Indian grant project in Africa for large scale was the military academy in Harar in Ethiopia in 1958. The famous General Raleigh and the Colonel set up that academy, and it trained officers of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one country in Africa never colonized, so they had their own independence. But they did something out of that academy which later became template for us, a regional approach. They started calling cadets from all over Africa of countries who are becoming free, like Ghana, Sudan, or were trying to be free, Zambia, and say, come and get trained. So the Harar Military Academy trained a lot of people. Now what NDA did later, Harar did in '58. It was not only military training, but also an education. So everybody got a bachelor's degree coming out of the Harar Military Academy, like the NDA started doing later. So again, this is the human resource development, capacity building, institution building approach, which was very, so India was seen as a benign partner, non-interfering, supportive. But in 1964, we created the ITEC program, India Technical and Economic Cooperation. As per a survey in my book of African Interlocutors, it is the most widely recognized Indian brand in Africa, because it has really done well. It's about $1 billion program, about a budget of 220 crores annually. It adapts quickly, reviews itself. During the pandemic, it went into e-ITEC. So it really reaches out to people, and we used to bring people from Africa to India who were not students but were professionals. And we, for instance, one time I remember we brought a lot of young parliamentarians, and they all said, this is great. China builds all our parliaments and you build our minds. So That was a different approach. We can't do big things, but we did what we thought we could do. So this training, and this is what today we call capacity building and skill development through ITEC, extremely well recognized. Now, quickly coming from here to the India-Africa summits, which were a brainchild of the African Union. It was not our initiative. African Union invited us to do a summit. So, what happened? President Kalam gave his idea of the Pan-African E-Network during his tour of Africa in 2004. And when we implemented that, the AU, African Union, which was born in 2002, agreed to be our partner. So we implemented it through the AU in 47 countries. So this was the largest spread of an Indian project, telemedicine and tele-education. At the same time, we had Indian economy doing well, so the Finance Ministry announced the India Development and Economic Assistance Scheme, ideas, under which we started giving concessional loans to Africa. Now this, I think, context is important. That what today we talk about debt stress, the debt stress of Africa was removed then. So all the Paris Club wiped out a lot of loans. India also wrote off some old loans. So the books of African LDCs were clean and they could borrow again. Now they did not want to borrow from the colonial master because their model was a more preferable model like India. They wanted Indian technology, Indian machinery, Indian ideas. And if India was ready to fund it, there they were. So while Japan, Korea and others would lend to 8 African countries who were investment grade, India was open to lending to the highly indebted poor countries who were not investment grade. So through this program, which ran roughly from 2004 to 2018-19, over this 15-year period, we have projects in 41 countries under Indian financing. And these projects were all undertaken by private Indian companies. As I said now, seeing this large move of Indian capital and the Pan-African E-Network, the African Union's first choice in 2006 for a new partnership was with India. Japan, the European Union and China had summits with Africa preceding the creation of the African Union. They were bilateral in nature. India was the first country which created a model of a 3-tier partnership. Bilateral existed, the regional, which is second tier, and the African Union tier. And this model followed the limited summit model of 15 countries for the first 2 summits, which was manageable. I have written in my book that had the African Union in 2006 proposed that we do a summit with all of Africa, India would have declined. We accepted it only because it was 15 countries. But in 2015, the third Africa summit, we invited the whole of Africa. I suspect with China than making real sense. I suspect the Africa Summit 4, whenever it is held, 7 years have gone, will go back to the manageable model. What did we do in these summits? We actually brought institution building. We took all these ideas and brought them into institutions. So we wanted to create, we expanded ITEC, expanded scholarships. We said we will build 100 training institutions in Africa. Some at the Pan-African level, some at the regional level, and some at the bilateral level. Out of these 100, about 35 actually were created. The sad part is that we were trying to fix the gap of Central Africa. Central Africa was our weak point. We had no interface there. So we wanted to fix it. So we gave many projects to Central African countries and less to countries with whom we were already related. So in my office there used to be a big map of every African country and what we had done there. And we saw the gaps and tried to plug them. The book shows and my surveys show that every project we tried to implement in Central Africa never took off. It's sad. So the idea to fill the gap. Why we did not push our ambassadors to deliver on this, still I don't know. So I have recommended in the book that there are 18 new embassies we have opened. The only job of those embassies is development cooperation. Make sure your ITEC slots are all utilized. Make sure your scholarships are all used. Make sure at least one development cooperation project succeeds. And that is how the embassy needs to be judged. What is the political goal that you are in Gambia that you are trying to fulfill? No. So, the other thing that we said was that our development cooperation is not only government, we also have private sector. So trade was very important. By 2010, India had reorganized its energy security and much more oil was coming from West Africa. So the trade in 2002, when the Focus Africa program was launched, our trade with Africa was $5 billion. It's about $89 billion. But it increased mainly because of oil. And today our biggest export to Africa is also processed oil. So crude oil comes in, processed oil goes back. And vehicles, pharmaceuticals, 20% of Indian pharmaceuticals go to Africa. Now, trade became very important, and despite having no major trade concession agreement, India-Africa trade came into the top 3-4, as you pointed out. So China is by far the biggest. It is always France and India who are normally next. All the others got left out. Our trade, we offered what is called a DFTP, Duty-Free Tariff Preference Scheme, which is a WTO compliant scheme for African LDCs to export to India, which is leading to cross investments to grow dal and stuff like that, which India wants. The second aspect which India did not realize, but the Africans did, was Indian FDI. So Indian FDI was never government policy. We always were hesitant about exporting capital. But Indians were crowding certain parts of Africa from the time of the license Raj. And now they went in much bigger ways after 1991. So we found that whenever we had a summit with any African leader, the first thing he spoke about was thank you for your investment. So then we had to start studying where is investment, and my book shows how difficult it is to study investment flows. If you ask RBI, they say Indian investment in Africa is 32 billion. But they only look what went from here, and it is largely SMEs. If you look at the investment commissions of African countries and add it up, it comes to 120 billion because they have very large figures. Anybody who looks like us is Indian investment. But in between there is the FT investment index, and if you study that, it is about 75 billion. And that is mainly because they study flows of Indian owned companies. So whether you came from Singapore like Godrej did, or you came from Netherlands like Airtel did, or you came from other centers like Mauritius, like Tata did, the FT index takes them all. So basic point is that Indian investment from the African point of view is immense. And in my survey it said that not the loans, it is FDI which is most coveted by the Africans from India. So that means this is what you want. I have 5 minutes? So what we did in these summits therefore was enlarge our scope for all the stuff that we had been doing, give it institutional backing, put in more money through the Exim Bank. But today, this, except for the ITEC and the human resource development, trade has taken off on its own and you are not in control of it. It goes up and down depending. Like today I think cereals in 2022 is the 4th largest export. Why? Ukraine crisis. Every year it is not there. So it depends. But I think it's doing fine. We don't need to try and be China or $200 billion because we don't import that much from Africa, where China imported the natural resources. Second aspect is investment. I think India should basically go the private sector route and say, let's support them rather than try and do things ourselves. In 2008, Harry Broadman for the World Bank did a study of China in Africa. But in that book he says, the book is a thing called The New Silk Route. In that he says that among all Africa's partners, the Indians are most respected because they transfer the most technology, create the most employment, and don't bother about concessional exports. They look at domestic and regional markets. Now with the Africa Continental FTA, the regional markets are the main draw, which means Indian kind of investment is what Africa really needs. But Indian investors, again the book survey shows, what are their problems? High cost of local finance, Indian banks in retreat, high cost of insurance, credit risk being high, not enough DPRs, what we call bankable projects. There are various problems they have made. How do we deal with it? I have suggested in the book that MEA, instead of now trying to put its grant funds into projects, should actually set up revolving funds. One revolving fund should be for consulting companies. Let Indian consulting companies go to Africa, create DPRs, because there is a $1 trillion opportunity under the Africa Investment Forum. But every year it remains a $1 trillion opportunity. So that means there are projects people are talking about, but nobody is developing them. So why don't Indian companies develop them, make consulting a business, and then put them up to the country who can approach anybody to finance it. And if the Indian company has a role and the project goes through, they can return the consulting money to the revolving fund. Give it a 5 to 10 year frame and fund it every year. The second part is that give lines of credit to regional banks in Africa, the Trade and Development Bank, EBID, and give it also to solid African banks, because Indian banks are not there anymore, they are retreating. Why? Give this money to them and say, I will give you this money, you will put it, this entire corpus on interest, and from that interest you subsidize lending to Indian investors who are coming to your country, so they get local financing at a lower cost. So you do something for your private sector, you also build African banking systems by giving them funding, and that will promote Indian investment, trade, whatever you want out of there. So these are nascent ideas which I must say MEA read the book, some of the ideas they have discussed with me, and we are seeing a new kind of a thing. And the third idea is, why denominate your lending to Africa in dollars? It is becoming stressful and they can't repay. And since we are promoting the rupee everywhere, why not start a new thing of rupee trade and lending to Africa? Rupee based. Give them a line of credit in rupees. Any case, your lines of credit are all to buy only from India, Indian goods and services. So why we in dollars? Put it in rupees. That way it may help. It will also make the rupee an international currency. So these are some of the ideas. But I am a strong votary that government should get out of business, just support. You know, we don't have double taxation avoidance agreements adequately. So how does that help Indian investors if you don't have enough DTAs? Our BPAs have all lapsed. We need to have more investment protection agreement. So we should focus on Africa to support the private sector investment. And I think one of the big areas where we can work is what is called impact investment. Achieve the SDGs through investment. I am part of a group which does it in the private sector, and we have already done many projects in Africa, but now we are working with opening an Africa fund. So the Germans have given the first $50 million, and we have to triple it to 150, and off we go. Meanwhile, MEA is following this trilateral model which I have been crying hoarse since my retirement. And already with Germany, there are projects going on in Cameroon, Ghana, Uganda, Malawi, one in Peru in Latin America, and more coming up with GIZ. These are the grant type projects, the capacity building projects. But with the UK, we have an impact investment fund that India and the UK have contributed equally under MEA and given the implementation to SBI caps. So they will implement the investment proposals for us. So I think these are baby steps, but I think they can do it. And finally, if you want to do big projects, then the India-EU connectivity partnership or the Build Back Better World We should get into that because our companies can deliver more cost effectively and our model is better accepted in Africa. Trilateral cooperation is beginning to work because Western G7 countries realize that India's model is better accepted in Africa than them. So coming with us saves you money, gets you better accepted, and may get you a better project. And this is where I close by saying, and if you do this, you will finally challenge China's DR. Otherwise, you have no hope. Thank you.